Four men sit down to write. They do not sit together. They are in different cities, writing to different people in different decades under different pressures. One of them is in a Roman tax booth, and he has just walked away from the most profitable career of his generation. One of them is young, barely more than a boy, and he is writing fast, the way a man writes when he has heard something so urgent he cannot slow down. One of them is a physician who has spent months tracking down eyewitnesses the way a detective tracks down evidence, interviewing old women in Galilean villages who still remember the smell of bread being multiplied on a hillside. And one of them is the oldest man alive who ever touched the hand of Jesus, and he is writing last from an island of black volcanic rock, knowing he will not live to see the scroll delivered. Four men, four scrolls, one life so large that no single human being could contain it in one document. You have probably held all four of these documents in your hand without realizing what you were holding. You have maybe wondered, if you are honest, why there are four of them. Maybe a skeptic has asked you that question across a dinner table. Maybe you have asked it yourself in a quiet moment. If the Bible is inspired by God, why didn't God just write one gospel? Why four accounts that sometimes tell the same story differently? Why four men with four perspectives on the same Jesus? That question is not a problem to be solved. It is a door to be opened. Because the answer, the real answer, changes the way you read every page of the New Testament. The Greek word for gospel is euangelion. It means literally good news, but that translation is too flat. In the ancient world, an euangelion was not just any good news, it was the news a royal herald announced when a king had won a battle. It was the proclamation that went out from the palace gates when a new ruler had ascended the throne. It was the word that traveled faster than any army, the news that changed everything for everyone, whether they had heard it yet or not. Four men wrote four euangelia about one king, and every single one of them was right. Start with Matthew. His name before Jesus found him was Levi. He sat in a tax booth on the road between Damascus and the Mediterranean coast in a town called Capernaum, and he collected money for the Roman Empire from his own people. In first-century Judea, that made him something close to a traitor. Tax collectors were barred from Jewish courts. They could not serve as witnesses. Rabbis debated whether you were even allowed to accept change from their hands. Levi was not merely unpopular, he was, by the religious standards of his day, ceremonially unclean. And then Jesus walked past his booth and said two words, "Follow me." Matthew never forgot where he came from. And that memory, that specific, personal memory of being called out of the worst version of himself, shaped every single word he wrote. Here's what most people miss about the Gospel of Matthew. It is not simply a biography of Jesus, it is a legal brief. Matthew was a man trained to record transactions, to document evidence, to build an airtight case. And when he sat down to write about Jesus, he built one. He quotes the Hebrew scriptures more than any other gospel writer, over 60 times. He organizes Jesus' teaching into 5 great blocks of material, deliberately echoing the 5 books of Moses. He opens with a genealogy that traces Jesus' bloodline from Abraham to David to the carpenter's house in Nazareth. He is saying something specific to a specific audience. He is saying, you have been waiting. You have been reading the prophets for 700 years. You have been asking when the king would come. He came. I was there. I watched him. And here is the evidence. Matthew's Jesus is a king. Not a distant king on a golden throne. A king who walks into your tax booth. A king who touches lepers and argues with Pharisees and feeds crowds on hillsides and weeps at gravesides. But a king nonetheless. And Matthew never lets you forget it. The word kingdom appears in Matthew's Gospel 56 times, more than any other book in the New Testament. Stay with me because this matters for what comes next. Every Gospel writer chose what to include. Matthew chose the Sermon on the Mount, the longest single teaching of Jesus in any Gospel. 5 chapters, a new law for a new covenant, delivered from a hillside the way the old law was delivered from a mountain. Matthew saw the parallel, and he wanted you to see it too. Moses went up the mountain and came down with stone tablets. Jesus sat down on the hillside and opened his mouth. And the words he spoke did not replace the law. They completed it.
Mà
Matthew
đến khi
begins his
đến ở bắt đầu
gospel with
phúc âm của
wise
mình
men
với các
traveling
nhà
from
thông
the
thái.
east, following a star, carrying gifts for a newborn king. He ends it with that same king standing on a mountain in Galilee, alive after 3 days in a tomb, giving 11 terrified and overwhelmed men a commission so large it has still not been completed 2,000 years later. Go, he says, all nations. I am with you always. Matthew, the man nobody would let testify in a Jewish court, wrote the book that has been read in more churches, more languages, more centuries than any other document in human history. That is what happens when a king calls you out of your tax booth. Now meet Mark. If Matthew is a lawyer building a case, Mark is a war correspondent filing a dispatch from the front lines. His gospel is the shortest of the four. It has no birth narrative, no genealogy, no Sermon on the Mount. It opens with John the Baptist in the wilderness and moves, immediately, urgently, almost breathlessly, into the ministry of Jesus. Mark has a favorite word. The Greek word is euthys. It means immediately. He uses it 41 times in 16 chapters. Immediately Jesus healed. Immediately he called them. Immediately they left their nets. You can feel the pace. You can feel the urgency. This is not a man writing for a library. This is a man writing for people who do not have time for long introductions. People who need to know right now what Jesus did and what it cost him. Mark wrote for Romans, the early church historian Papias of Hierapolis, writing around AD 110, close enough to the events to have spoken with people who knew the apostles personally, tells us something remarkable. He says that Mark did not invent his gospel from scratch. He recorded the sermons of the apostle Peter. Mark was Peter's translator, his traveling companion, his scribe. When Peter stood up in a Roman house church and described the day Jesus walked on water, Mark was in the room writing it down. When Peter wept over his 3 denials and told that story with the kind of specific shame only an eyewitness carries, Mark heard it, and Mark wrote it. Here's the part nobody tells you. Mark's gospel is the only gospel that records something that sounds almost like an embarrassing detail. That when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, a young man was following him, wearing only a linen cloth. And when the soldiers grabbed him, he ran away naked, leaving the cloth behind. No other gospel records this. Most scholars believe that young man was Mark himself. If so, he included his own moment of cowardice in the account. He did not edit himself out. That is the kind of honesty that makes a document trustworthy. Mark's Jesus is a servant, not a diminished figure, a servant in the ancient, powerful sense. A king who makes himself low. The word Mark reaches for most often is not teacher or rabbi. It is a word that carries the image of hands, working hands, healing hands. Hands that touch what polite society would not touch. The skin of a leper, the eyelids of a blind man, the bier of a widow's dead son. Mark gives you a Jesus who acts before he explains. A Jesus who heals first and teaches second. A Jesus constantly moving, constantly reaching, constantly going to the next town, the next crowd, the next desperate person, calling his name from the side of the road. And now watch what happens next. Because the third gospel writer does something none of the others do. Luke investigates. He says so himself in the opening 4 verses of his gospel, the most carefully constructed Greek sentence in the entire New Testament. Luke tells his reader, a man named Theophilus, that he has carefully investigated everything from the beginning and spoken with eyewitnesses. Luke is a physician. He thinks the way a physician thinks, in symptoms and histories and careful observation. He is the only gospel writer who was almost certainly not Jewish. He is writing for the educated Greek-speaking world, for people who have heard rumors about a Jewish teacher who rose from the dead and want to know if any of it holds up to scrutiny.
Tiếng
Luke's
Hy
Greek
Lạp
is
của Luke thật đẹp.
beautiful. It is the most literary Greek in the New Testament, shifting registers between elevated prose and conversational storytelling, the way a great novelist shifts between description and dialogue. And Luke alone gives you certain things. He alone gives you the full Christmas story as you know it. The angel Gabriel visiting Mary, the inn with no room, the shepherds in the fields, the baby in the feeding trough. He alone gives you the story of the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, sitting among the teachers, asking questions that left trained scholars speechless. He alone gives you the parable of the prodigal son, arguably the most psychologically precise story about shame and grace, and a father who runs toward his child ever told in any language. The Greek word Luke uses for Jesus more than any other gospel writer is Kyrios, Lord. But his Jesus is also the most human Jesus in the four gospels. Luke gives you a Jesus who prays more than any other account records, a Jesus who notices the widow before anyone else does, a Jesus whose genealogy, and this is deliberate, does not trace back to Abraham like Matthew's. It traces back to Adam, to the first human being. Because Luke's Jesus is not only the Jewish Messiah, he is the Son of Man. He came for all of them, for every nation that has ever existed, for Theophilus, for you. Pay attention to this. Matthew traces Jesus back to Abraham, the father of one nation. Luke traces Jesus back to Adam, the father of every nation. Same genealogy, same man. Completely different point. That is not contradiction. That is stereoscopic vision. Two eyes aimed at the same object, producing depth that neither eye alone could create. And then there is John. By the time John sits down to write his gospel, the other three already exist. He knows Matthew's account, he knows Mark's, he knows Luke's careful investigation, and he makes a decision that no other gospel writer made. He does not try to repeat what they have already said. He goes deeper. John's gospel opens with 18 words that have stopped readers cold for 2,000 years. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek term he uses is logos, and you need to understand what that word meant to the people who first read it. Because it was not simply word the way you mean word when you speak one aloud. In Greek philosophy, the logos was the rational principle behind all existence. It was the force that held the cosmos together, that made mathematics true and music beautiful and the stars move in predictable paths. The Stoic philosophers had been writing about the logos for 4 centuries. Every educated person in the Roman world knew the concept. John takes that word, that enormous, cosmic, philosophical word, and aims it like an arrow directly at a carpenter from Nazareth. He is not saying Jesus was a great teacher. He is not saying Jesus was an inspiring figure. He is saying the force that holds the universe together put on skin and walked into human history and called 12 ordinary men by name. And John was one of them. Here is what you need to know about John. He is old when he writes this. Very old. Every other apostle is dead. Most of them executed. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. James, John's own brother, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa. Thomas traveled to India, Andrew to Greece. One by one, the men who ate with Jesus and argued with Jesus and ran from the soldiers in Gethsemane. They are gone. John is the last one left. He is living on an island called Patmos, a small black volcanic rock in the Aegean Sea, used by the Roman Empire as a place to send troublemakers who were too prominent to execute and too dangerous to leave free. John is there because he will not stop talking about Jesus. He is there because an old man with no weapons and no army has somehow frightened the most powerful empire in the world. And from that island, he writes the 4th gospel. This is the moment the whole script has been moving toward. Because that old man on the black rock is the same man who, as a young fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, heard Jesus say, "Follow me," and left his nets without asking a single question. He has followed for 60 years. He has outlived everyone. He has watched the movement Jesus started with 12 men spread across the known world. He has seen it survive persecution, exile, execution, and the burning of Jerusalem. And now, on this island, with nothing but time and memory and the Holy Spirit, he writes the things the other 3 did not write. John alone gives you the wedding at Cana, the first miracle, water becoming wine at a party, because a woman asked her son to help and her son could not say no to her. John alone gives you the conversation with Nicodemus at midnight, a Pharisee who comes to Jesus in the dark because he cannot afford to be seen in the daylight. And Jesus tells him something so strange and so beautiful that people have been putting it on signs at football games for 50 years. John alone gives you the woman at the well in Samaria, a conversation Jesus was not supposed to have with a person he was not supposed to speak to about water that never runs dry. John alone gives you Lazarus, 4 days dead, bound in grave clothes, and Jesus standing at the entrance of the tomb, and the shortest verse in all of Scripture. Jesus wept. 2 words. In the Greek, it is 1 word, etakryson. He shed tears, not the loud, theatrical grief of the mourners around him. Silent tears. The God of the universe standing at the grave of his friend, crying. John gives you that because John was there. John saw the tears on his face before he raised his voice and called a dead man out of the dark. And this is where it gets remarkable, because John's gospel is simultaneously the most divine portrait of Jesus and the most intimate. Matthew shows you the king. Mark shows you the servant. Luke shows you the Son of Man. John shows you something that contains all three and goes further still. He shows you a God who weeps, a God who kneels on the floor of an upper room and washes the dirt off his disciples' feet the night before he dies, a God who, from a cross, looks down at his mother and makes sure she will be taken care of after he is gone. John's Jesus is the Logos, the Word, the rational force behind all creation. And that Word, at the moment of his greatest agony, is worried about his mother. That is not the portrait of a distant deity. That is the portrait of someone who loves you with a specificity that should take your breath away. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in AD 180, was the first theologian to formally name all 4 Gospels as authoritative. And he reached for an image to explain why there were 4 of them and not 1. He pointed to the 4 living creatures in the vision of Ezekiel, a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. 4 faces, 1 throne. Matthew's Jesus, he said, is the lion, the king of Israel. Mark's Jesus is the ox, the servant, the worker. Luke's Jesus is the man, the son of Adam, the one who came for all humanity. John's Jesus is the eagle, soaring above the others, beginning not with a birth or a baptism, but with the eternal moment before time began. 4 faces. 1 Jesus. Not a contradiction. A completion. So why 4 Gospels? Not because God was disorganized. Not because the early church could not agree on one account. Not because Matthew and Luke and Mark and John were contradicting each other across the centuries, like witnesses who cannot get their stories straight. 4 Gospels because one angle was never going to be enough. Think about the people you love most in your life. The person who has known you longest. Your mother, maybe, or the friend who was in the room when everything fell apart. Now think about how they would describe you to a stranger. They would tell true things, accurate things, things that happened. And yet no single one of them would give the complete picture. Your colleague sees something your mother never sees. Your oldest friend knows something your spouse is still learning. The person who met you in your worst season knows a version of you that the people who only know your best season have never encountered. You are not contradicted by those different accounts. You are completed by them. Jesus is not contradicted by 4 Gospels. He is completed by them. Here's the first thing to take with you. The 4 Gospels are not a problem for your faith. They are the architecture of it. The fact that God chose 4 human beings with 4 distinct personalities, 4 distinct audiences, and 4 distinct angles of vision, and that all 4 accounts, written across decades, hold together as a coherent portrait of one man, that is not a weakness of Scripture. That is one of its most extraordinary arguments for authenticity. Fabricated stories converge on details. True accounts diverge on perspective while agreeing on substance. Matthew and John and Mark and Luke all agree on the empty tomb. They all agree on the resurrection appearances. They all agree that this man died publicly and was alive again, and that the people who saw him after were so certain of what they had seen that they died rather than say otherwise. 4 witnesses, one verdict. Here is the second thing. You need all four, not just your favorite, not just the one that matches your personality or your theology, or the one your pastor quotes most often. You need Matthew's king when you are tempted to reduce Jesus to a life coach. You
Bạn
need
cần người
Mark's
hầu của Mark.
servant when you have convinced yourself that following Jesus is about status and comfort and arriving somewhere impressive. You need Luke's Son of Man when your faith has quietly become exclusive. When you have forgotten that
Rằng
Jesus
Chúa giê
traced
đến
his
xu lần
line
theo
back to
dòng dõi
Adam,
của mình trở lại
not just
đến Đam.
Abraham, and that the table he set was always bigger than the room you had in mind. And you need John's Logos, the cosmic, eternal, before the beginning Jesus. On the days when your problems feel larger than your God, on the days when the grave feels final, on the days when you are standing at the entrance of something dark and you need to know that the one standing beside you has already called the dead by name, you need all four. And here is the third thing, and this is the one to carry. John is the last one alive. Every other apostle is gone. The man who laid his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper has outlived persecution and exile and the death of everyone he loved. He is on an island. He is old. He has every reason to be bitter or exhausted or silent. And he writes one more time. Not because he has new information, not because the other three got it wrong, but because 60 years of living with the resurrection has not dimmed what he saw, it has clarified it. 60 years of following Jesus across every kind of terrain a human life contains, joy and grief and betrayal and restoration and loss and wonder, and John sits down on that black volcanic rock and writes words that still have not lost their power. In the beginning was the Word. He was there in the beginning. He is here now. He will be there at the end. 4 men tried to describe him. They gave us everything they had. And still, as John himself admits in the very last verse of his gospel, if everything Jesus did were written down, the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. That is the Jesus the 4 Gospels are pointing at. Not a figure you have fully understood. Not a doctrine you have completely mastered. Not a story you have outgrown. A person. Alive. Larger than any single account of him. Larger than all 4 combined. And he is still saying the same 2 words he said to a tax collector in a booth by the road, and to a fisherman mending nets on a Galilean shore, and to a physician who wanted to investigate, and to an old man on a black rock who had followed him for 60 years and had not once regretted it. Follow me. If this video opened something for you, if you have been carrying questions about the Gospels and this gave you a new way to hold them, share it with someone who is asking the same questions. And if you want to go deeper, the next video walks through the Gospel of John chapter by chapter, starting from that opening line that stopped the ancient world cold. It is waiting for you. We will see you there.